today. I was looking to see if our boss, Merrick, is on yet. I don't see him yet, but maybe he'll join us momentarily. I'm going to stop sharing the screen for just a moment, and then we can put the agenda back up in a couple of minutes. So my name is Kerry Griffin. I'm with the Pacific Fishery Management Council. This is a publicly noticed meeting. It's a briefing. It's basically a joint briefing between the National Marine Sanctuaries and Pacific Fishery Management Council, although sanctuaries are doing the bulk of the briefing here. Let's see. This meeting is being recorded, and we will also be posting the slides that you'll be seeing today to the meeting webpage. And if that webpage isn't already in the chat, can someone do it? Couple of ground rules to cover. Just because we have a lot of moving parts and a lot of people here, please use the raise hand feature. We'll do our best to get to people when we get to the Q&A sections. And we'll have a little bit more about how we're actually going to run the Q&A and all that stuff a little bit later. We're going to save most questions until after everyone has given their briefings, please. The chat is really useful for providing information, links, things like that, but please don't use it as a place to pose questions or to have sidebar conversations. I think it just tends to distract from the people who are speaking and presenting, and we can't keep up with those questions. So avoid using the chat as asking questions or making comments. Use it to share information, or of course, if you have technical problems, you can post something there. And you can also email me or Jesse Dorkinghouse if you have questions. We don't have a public comment slot on this meeting. We normally do for all of our publicly noticed meetings, but we're sort of a little bit short on time here. And honestly, the best way to make comment on the materials you're going to hear is at the council meeting coming up in the forum of the council. And of course, the sanctuaries are taking their own comments. They have their own comment vehicles. But if you want to comment as part of this in context of the Pacific Fishery Management Council, then you can submit written or verbal comments at the council meeting itself. This is primarily informational, and it's to provide, it's aimed at the council's advisory bodies. So we've invited all of our advisory bodies to attend. I see many of you here, and council members, of course. There's members of the public as well. And the reason I'm saying this is because this isn't intended as an opportunity to get into discussion on, the merits or the comments or the, feedback or that sort of thing with what, the two agenda items. This is primarily informational. So any questions should be, questions of clarity to make sure you understand the issues and, the functions of what's happening and the intent. The council's advisory bodies, they'll have their chance to have their own discussions and decide how they want to respond, what sort of advice they want to give to the council and stuff like that. But that should be saved for a different time. So we'll focus on questions from the council's advisory bodies, and if we have time to turn to the public, then we would be happy to do that. I just don't know if we'll have time to do that at this meeting. So I think those were the sort of ground rules and framing that I wanted to cover before we move on. Jesse, did I miss anything as far as logistics or anything else?
Nope, Carrie. And I did just see there was I got a direct message, and this will apply to most people. If you're logged in as like an iPad or a phone number, if you wouldn't mind just like posting in the chat who you are, that would be great, just so we can make a note of that for the attendees list.
Yeah, that would be great. Oh, and did we start recording? Yes, we did. Thank you.
Yes, I got it.
Did you start the transcript also?
Yes, it's going.
Okay, great, thanks. Sounds good. Okay, then I'm not sure if Merrick was able to join us. Merrick Burden, I don't see him. I do see Kelly Ames, our deputy director. So if Merrick, you're there and I'm not seeing you, just please unmute yourself. But if he's not there, Kelly, would you mind unmuting and just giving us a welcome on behalf of Merrick?
Thanks, Carrie. I don't see Merrick hopping in here, so I'm happy to welcome the group. I really want to just extend our thanks to the sanctuary folks and for council staff. I know Jesse has a presentation in here as well in helping us coordinate these items for the September council meeting, the Coral Restoration and Research Plan, as well as the Chumash Heritage Sanctuary designation. So really appreciate the time the sanctuary staff has put to help coordinate this briefing, and also thanks to the folks that are online to receive it. We have quite a large agenda for the September council meeting, and this type of preparatory online briefing is really essential to help us move efficiently through our advisory body meetings and council floor time. So with that, just again, express my thanks, and I'll hand it back over to you, Carrie.
Thank you, Callie, and I appreciate you stepping in there. So what we're going to do now, you should see the agenda up there. We're going to turn to the first agenda item. That's the Greater Farallones and Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary's Coral Research and Restoration item. We have several representatives from the sanctuary program. And then the second item is a little bit later. That is the Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary, and the designation documents and proposed rule and all that stuff was released today. So I'm sure that you guys have been busy putting those together. So anyway, Karen Reyna, I'm going to turn it over to you, please. And if you and Karen Grimmer could introduce your people from sanctuaries, we'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you. Hold on, let me also go on screen so folks can see me. I'm hoping everyone can hear me.
We can hear you, and we can see the first slide.
Perfect. Okay, great. Give me a moment here as I get everything organized. Okay, great. Thank you, Carrie, and thank you really to the council staff for helping us coordinate this briefing today. I'm Karen Reyna. I'm the Resource Protection Coordinator for the Greater Farallones and Cordell Bank National Marine Sanctuaries. And today, presenting and joining me are Karen Grimmer, who's the Resource Protection Coordinator for the Monterey Bay Sanctuary, and Sage Tezak, who's supporting both sanctuaries on GIS. We are doing this briefing on deep sea coral research and restoration scoping. And just to set the stage here, the purpose of this briefing is to provide a high-level overview of the scoping document, and we're debuting today the geospatial tool for a potential public process for the Pacific Fishery Management Council to consider designating areas within the Greater Farallones and Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuaries that allow for both deep sea coral research and restoration. Excuse me. The Office of National Marine Sanctuaries has provided this document to the council briefing book for their consideration at the September council meeting. So we're here today to present those elements. And if you have questions, we just ask that you hold them until the end as the presentation, we'll give you an overview. And then when we get into the tool, we are hoping the tool will answer maybe some additional questions that you may have. Okay, so the purpose of the scoping document. The scoping document represents the Greater Farallones and Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary's long-term need for deep sea coral research and restoration areas. so that research and restoration may occur without intentional impacts to the seafloor from bottom contact fishing gear. And that's why we're here. Just to give you a little bit on context, it's important you have the context regarding the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries request to the Council. Since their establishment, deep sea coral communities in Greater Fairlands and Monterey Bay sanctuaries have been damaged or destroyed as a result of sunken vehicles, vessels, or other large objects. And the most recent large incident that caused significant long-term and irreparable damage resulted from the sinking of the YFD-70 dry dock in 2016. And we presented about this at the March Council meeting. So the damages from the sinking of the YFD-70 dry dock were quantifiable, and there's a way to restore what has been damaged. And as such, and with other incidents, there's a need to conduct long-term deep sea coral research and restoration, which would have several benefits, including the restoration or enhancement of deep sea coral communities and the ecosystem services they provide, enhancing our understanding of the role and importance of deep sea coral communities, including the role as groundfish essential fish habitat, understanding how the impacts of climate change, such as ocean acidification, affect these communities, and possibly contributing to the fisheries ecosystem plan, responding to future research and restoration needs, and lastly, meeting our respective mandates and obligations. So that's a little bit about the context, and now we'll get into the location and area criteria. So earlier this year, Office of National Marine Sanctuaries hosted workshops with 15 deep sea coral research and restoration experts from around the country to receive input on the identification of suitable areas for deep sea coral research and restoration. And the following criteria were used. First, appropriate range of depth. The depth range is a critical criteria to meet multiple elements of the purpose. It's important as it speaks to the minimum and maximum depths where both research and restoration can occur. And details about the depth range can be found in the scoping document. Also, appropriate substrate. That is hard or hard and mixed substrate. Known coral locations, areas where we know that there are corals and there are abundance of corals. Proximity to source corals for outplanting. What that means is that in order to outplant and restore, you have to find a source for corals. So taking those pieces of corals and moving them to the location where you want to do the restoration, that proximity is important. And of sufficient size for both research and restoration. Okay, I've used the word areas to describe the precise places with specific boundaries. And those areas are based on 5 larger locations that were identified as suitable based on the scientific criteria, but also based on current protections. In addition to protections from the National Marine Sanctuary regulations, these 5 locations also overlap with EFH conservation areas that prohibit groundfish bottom trawling. And what resulted there is the 10 potential areas within those locations. Briefly going to go through them. The first is offshore South Point Arena. The second is the football. The third is Cochrane Bank Fanny Shoals. The fourth is Ano Nuevo Ascension Canyon Complex. And finally, Sur Ridge. As we go through each area, and in the interest of time, we're not going to read the details on the size, depth range, target species for outplanting, et cetera, written on the slides. However, that information and more is provided in Table 2 in the scoping document. So if you are interested in seeing this and those details, please look at the scoping document and look at Table 2. Now we head to the Greater Fairlands National Marine Sanctuary location. 3 locations were identified within the sanctuary, and these maps can be found in the scoping document. Each has a range of areas which are mutually exclusive or nested, meaning they offer alternatively sized configurations for restoration within the larger location, and I'll illustrate that as we go along. So here's the first area, offshore South Point Arena. As you can see from this figure, the smallest area, offshore South Point Arena 1, is encompassed in our nested within the largest area. Therefore, we're not scoping for 3 different distinct areas. Again, I'll illustrate this even more when we get to the tool. The first area, OSPA 1. Before I go into details here, maps showing each area overlaid with the substrate type and depth is also in the scoping document. Again, the criteria for deep sea coral research and restoration includes the fact that the area contains places with hard and mixed substrate. And so you're seeing that in this map, shown in red and brown, or the dark areas of the map, and at suitable depths. And so on this map are depth ranges in feet and fathoms. As we move to each area, Karen Grimmer and I will point out some key elements from that particular area. So for OSPA 1, it is the shallowest area of the 3 OSPA areas. It includes a cluster of known rocky features that have been visually explored via ROV, and one additional area where the interpretive substrate is at a suitable depth for research and restoration. OSPA 2, the depths at this area include a greater diversity of deep sea corals as compared to OSPA 1, and would allow for additional species of corals that may be suitable for outplanting. This could result in additional studies about fish associations at different depths. And at the shallowest extent, at the eastern boundary, which I will show you in the geospatial tool, there are high relief rocky features that have been visually explored via ROV and are considered to be fish hotspots with numerous and very large cowcod, yellow eye, lingcod, boccaccio, and canary rockfish. These features were not included in OSPA 1, so that's the difference there. Now, OSPA 3 is the largest area and has a high presence of rocky substrate, including areas in the northmost part of the boundary that are not included in OSPA 1 or OSPA 2. Next is the football. So there is scientific interest in the connectivity between offshore South Point Arena location and the football, including whether one area provides a source of propagals for corals for the other, and whether corals from one area would be a source for outplanting for the other. This is because the substrate types within the shallower extent of the depth range of the offshore South Point Arena location are similar to those observed in the football. The substrate at the football here is unique because it is low relief hard substrate and layered rock that can be ideal for deep sea coral outplanting, given the consistency of the habitat for adding structure forming habitat. This can result in additional habitat for high densities of rockfish found in these areas. And in this image that you see on the left, you see what this unique habitat is and how some rockfish are using it within the areas of layered rock. So area F1 is the core of where high densities of rockfish were observed in areas of layered rock. F2 also includes that rocky and mixed substrate. The F2 area has more available low relief substrate, like in that photo, in the north. And it is likely the additional predicted habitat in F2 will provide more suitable places for deep sea coral restoration, given the unique habitat in this entire location. Finally, there's Cochrane Bank Fanny Shoals. And this location is the shallowest of all 5 locations and provides unique opportunities for deep sea coral research at shallower depths and restoration of a very specific species, the red whip gorgonian, that is unique to these depths. An important research question to answer at this location is how the area is affected by the California current. Get into that a little bit more here. So the first area is CB, and you can see it's encompassing Cochrane Bank. A unique finding from this location, which is within this specific area, was the collection of Christmas tree coral, which is the image on the left and is also the coral background on my screen, and I think Karen Grimmer's screen too. Although this is not a coral that would be outplanted, the observation represents the northernmost occurrence to date, and there are reasons why this may be occurring that is related to the California current, and that is explained in the scoping document. Finally, there's the CBFS area. It is the larger of the two areas, and it's the shallowest of all 5 locations. It encompasses all of the CB area. The history of trawling and historic other fishing, coupled with current protections, could make this larger area an ideal place to study how fisheries management actions may affect the recruitment and growth of deep sea corals. In particular, propagation of the Christmas tree coral is of interest to science and could be tracked as part of a passive restoration project, meaning that if you leave it undisturbed, you can allow it to propagate and then track that. Passive restoration of deep sea corals biogenic habitat could also be studied at this location to see about how it recruits and grows based on changes to fishery management measures over time. This area offers additional research benefits as it includes an area currently open to fixed gear fishing. And now we are going to move to the locations within Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary, and I'm going to turn it over to Karen Grimmer.
Thank you, Karen. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Karen Grimmer, Resource Protection Coordinator with Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. I'm going to be providing information on sanctuary ecologically significant areas, which contributed to the 3 selected deep sea coral research and restoration areas in our sanctuary, and which you can see here in the 2 maps. So go ahead to the next slide. So back in 2013, we worked with a number of scientists, fishermen, NGOs, and other agencies to identify remarkable representative and or sensitive marine habitats, communities, and ecological processes. We compiled over 150 GIS data layers and ultimately identified these CISAs, as you'll see in this map. So the data from that process actually fed into the data review for the Año Nuevo Ascension Canyon Complex and Sur Ridge proposed areas, as well as, of course, as new data. So next slide. So let's take a look at the 2 proposed areas in the Año Nuevo Ascension Canyon Complex. There are 2 separate areas here that could both be considered for adoption as research and restoration areas. Next slide. We'll start with Año Nuevo. This canyon complex, as many of you know, it's a highly productive area based on the upwelling originating from Año Nuevo. It has high densities of krill and rockfishes associated with corals in the shallower areas. The corals live on rock outcrops surrounded by fine sediment habitat, and bamboo corals are particularly abundant here. And after discussions among deep sea coral experts in the workshop that we had too, actually, it was concluded that there are research needs in the upper canyon areas, but outplanting deep sea corals should be focused in deeper areas of the canyons. And you can see here in the map, the red hard bottom here in the Año Nuevo Canyon map. So please take a look at the stats. As Karen said, Sur Ridge is approximately 28 miles away and could be a potential source of corals to outplant at either of these locations. And as Karen mentioned, proximity between source and outplanting locations is important, as less distance will minimize time in transport. So moving to Ascension Canyon area, this proposed area is about half the size of the Año Nuevo Canyon area at just under 3 square nautical miles. You can see the stats on the slide and the types of corals found in this area. It has a similar habitat to the Año Nuevo Canyon. Go ahead, next slide. So lastly, we have Sur Ridge, which is where all of the techniques for deep sea coral outplanting have been developed in Monterey Bay Sanctuary, working with Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute and the Sanctuary Research Team since 2013. It's the site of an MBARI-led deep sea coral observatory, and so far 8 groups of corals have been successfully translocated in the northern portion of Sur Ridge. Can you go to the next slide? So Sur Ridge is really spectacular for its diversity and abundance of deep sea coral species, with bamboo corals numbered in the thousands of individuals. And as you can see here, it's the deepest of the 10 proposed areas and also the largest. So those are the areas in Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. I'm going to now hand it off to our GIS guru, Sage Tazak, to demonstrate the scoping tool. And this tool is for you. She developed it for you, and it can be built upon and added to. And she's going to run us through how it works.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you. My name is Sage Tezak, the GIS analyst for both Greater Fairlands and Cordell Bank National Marine Sanctuaries. And I will share some tips and tricks that you see here in the tool. And at the end of the presentation, I will share a link to the tool so you'll have access to it. And it's also posted on our website, which we will share. So it's a living tool, and we have already identified some changes we'd like to make. So if you see something, please, reach out and let us know, because these change to help you engage in the scoping process. So again, this tool accompanies the Deep Sea Coral Restoration and Research Scoping document, and there's a link provided here on the splash page. The map contains over 60 data layers that will help inform the public during the development of potential actions the council may take. So I'll just quickly go over some of the different buttons that you'll see here. So over on the left-hand side, you have a plus and a minus, which will allow you to zoom in and zoom out. A home button will return you to the default position of the map. Just to the left of the data layers, there's 2 buttons, a base map and a measure tool. The base map allows you to change the base map. Early on in the development of this tool, we received a request to add the NOAA chart. So that can be found here in this list of base maps, along with many others. The measure tool can measure both distances and areas. So here's a distance. You begin your area you'd like to distance or measure, and then double click to end, and your distance will show up. To clear it out, you can hit new measurement. And then for area, if you would like to trace the vertices of the area you're interested in measuring, and double click to end, and then your area was shown here. And you can choose the different units you would like to measure in. So for example, there's 1,500 square kilometers. And you can either close the X or close new measurement. Above data layers, there are 4 buttons. The information tab is basically what I'm going over here today, but there is another link to the scoping document in this information tab. bookmarks. There's 6 bookmarks, and these will take you to each of the specific locations that Karen and Karen have discussed today. There is, let's go back to the original extent. There is a print button. Say, for example, you turn on some data and you would like to print that. You can change the title. So this is the football. And then I encourage you to pull this box down, and next to the advanced, there's a downward arrow, which you have additional parameters you can set. You can include the legend, a north arrow, choose the metric you would like your scale bar measured in, and then you hit the print button. For this, and then your print results, you can see the button here. The print results will show up here, and for the sake of time, this is what your map will look like. Oh, you can't see that. The map you spit out the map you print will show up in another tab, and then there's a share button, and this share button just allows you to copy a link onto your clipboard, and you can email it. And now the data layers, which is probably the most important. The first thing I just want to point out is that you do need to scroll in order to see the complete list of data layers available. The second part is when you see a right arrow, or an arrow pointing to the right, that means this is the parent folder and there are sub-layers or subfolders below. And so if, for example, you would like to see deep sea corals and sponges, nothing is showing up because your parent layer isn't on. So it's tripped me up a couple times. So make sure that the parent layer is toggled on. And then there's 3 dots here, and this provides additional capabilities to the right of each data layer. You can zoom to increase or decrease transparency. And then if you're interested in learning more about the data, where it's from, how it was collected, how it was processed, you can click the details, and that will bring you to the data, information about the data. And lastly, I just want to share in the legend, in order to see everything, you have to scroll down. So here you can see the legend for substrate type. And now I will turn it over to Karen Reyna, who will share some more details on the data.
Thank you so much, Sage. We have time to go. Well, we will go to. Thank you, Sage. You're already there. We'll go to the area, the northernmost area, and just walk through some of the things that are available, some of the data layers that are available for you in the tool, and we'll drill down so you can see those parent layers versus what details are available, because there's a lot here. As Sage said, over 60 layers. And then we'll also, after this, go to Sir Ridge as just another example. So you'll get the more northernmost area and the southernmost area as examples. So what Sage has open right now has to do with these areas, right? And we talked about nesting versus not nesting. And this is just a way to see it a lot more clearly. Right now, Sage, she's turning off each layer individually and turning them back on. And as you can see how it builds upon each other as you go from OSPA 1 to 2 to 3, just as an example. And another thing to point out here, when Sage turned on the parent layer in this data layer for areas, all of them are going to turn on. So as Sage zooms out to the whole region, what you're going to see just briefly is when you first turn on that layer, all of them are going to, oh, wow, those are the corals. I think those are the corals too, but you'll see all those, there it goes. You'll see all of them showing up. So if you want that big 10,000 foot view, you've got it there. So then back to the offshore South Point Arena area and the 3 OSPA 1, 2, and 3. Sage had the coral data on, and she already explained to you about parent data versus the sub-data. So we're just interested in this case in just corals. So Sage is going to turn off the sponge data and just turn on the coral data. So now you can see where those corals are in this area. And that's part of the story, and that's part of the criteria that was used to help select areas. Another important criteria that we talked about is depth. And of course, we have the bathymetry data available. So she has the contours in both meters and fathoms. And the meters, there's a few key contours that are being shared here. You see in those red lines. 50 meters. That is the shallowest extent of deep sea corals as defined by NOAA. And then you have the 110 meter line, which is the shallowest extent where restoration has successfully occurred. And then you have the 1340 meter line, and that's the deepest extent of where restoration has occurred. So when you see each of these areas in relation to these depths, you'll see that they all hit between that 50 and 1340 meter mark. Back to fathoms, there's a lot of layers of fathoms here, so then you can really see these depths in more details. If you are interested in the precise depth ranges, that's back to table 2 in the scoping document, where through GIS, we were able to give you these precise depth ranges for every one of the 10 areas. The next data layer that we are going to discuss is a substrate. And there are 2 substrate data layers. And the first one is the U.S. West Coast seafloor in duration. Oops, wrong one. Sorry, Sage. And this is going to look familiar to anyone who is involved in the NTRCA process, and before that, the EFH conservation area designation process for the groundfish trawl sector. So that is a coastwide data layer, and in that data layer, when you click it, below the parent, you'll see that there's these 3 levels of data. And if Sage turns off the first two, what you're going to see come up is data quality. And we wanted to point this out here because in this particular location, and also just south where the football is, where you can kind of see it at the bottom of Sage's screen, you can see that data quality area is mostly a 1. And why that's important is that we realized that we needed to bring in more recent data and data that had been collected through USGS, through ROV surveys, and interpreted from multi-beam. And so that is called substrate. Now, this data layer is only going to apply to where USGS has done this level of surveying. So it's actually only in the 3 areas or 3 locations that are part of the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary. But we've provided this so that when you look at this, you can see more precise data. Now, going back to the offshore South Point Arena area, plural, the 3, the location. I was talking about the area in the east that had species of rockfish in high abundance. We provided a few of those species. We pulled in cowcod and yellow eye. And so now you can kind of see where they were showing up. And in particular, although it looks like, you know, they're extensive through the south, the area where SAGE's cursor is, which is encompassed in offshore Point Arena, OSPR, or offshore South Point Arena 2 and 3, that's the area we were talking about right there where there is a high abundance. We also provided habitat suitability probability for yellow eye that was part of the EFH review process. Finally, you do have the NTRCA data available, and probably most important to many people who are listening today is the data on fishing that we have. So what we've brought in is data that goes back as early as 2002 and all the way to 2021. It's fishing effort to the extent we had it for the different sectors, so you can click and see what's available. We have fishing intensity, we have the Trawl Observer Program data, we have that before and after the EFH conservation area designations in 2006, before and after gear modifications in the early to mid 2000s, and also the West Coast groundfish bottom trawl surveys, coral and sponge catch. So this is all data layers that are available to you. To the extent we had them available, we brought them in. So what I just showed you is basically available coastwide, or, you know, throughout these 5 locations. But where we'd like to end is just on Thur Ridge, because there's some additional data there that we want to make sure that you're aware of. So as Karen Grimmer mentioned, there is active research and restoration occurring at Thur Ridge. And SAGE has just turned on the explored transects, and then also the equipment deployed. So those are the stars that you see there. And so that is active research and restoration. And when we get to questions and answers, we'll be introducing one of the scientists who is working there. And then finally, Karen Grimmer had mentioned CISAs. That CISA data is also available, and you can see here how Thur Ridge lines up with one of the CISAs that how was identified through that Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary process. And then finally, Sage, I don't think you turned on, we talked about the NTRCA, I don't think you turned on, yep, there it is. There's, just for reference, the EFH conservation areas. If you click on the items under the parent, you'll see that you can, you know, what comes on by default are the current conservation areas, but you can also turn on that seaward of 1,000 or 700 fathom bottom trawl area. And you can also look at the former conservation areas that were in existence from 2005 to 2019. And that is it. And we have one last little slide, and then we're going to hand it over to Jesse. So, Sage, I'm going to bump you off here. Okay, I hope you all can see this. So we just wanted to end with, you know, letting you know that for general questions, so you can all see this, right? Okay. Thank you. So we just wanted to end with letting you know that we're here to answer questions. So if we run out of time today and you have general questions or just want additional information, you can contact Daryl Gregg. He's on our team and is helping coordinate this project between the 2 sanctuaries. And of course, you met Sage, and for technical questions related to the geospatial scoping tool or suggestions on data layers, you can reach out to Sage directly. And with that, I will hand it over to Jesse.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, just real quick, everyone. This is Jessie Dorbinghouse with council staff. I wanted to just draw your attention to the council action in September. And you'll note that the item is actually scheduled as an administrative item because one of the questions that's in front of the council is which fisheries do the council want to limit fishing to in these proposed areas? Is it just groundfish bottom contact gear, all bottom contact gear, or all fishing? So council staff, with a lot of help from CDFW staff, put together a brief white paper describing which fisheries may operate in the proposed locations of these coral restoration sites. You'll see for our council managed fisheries, including groundfish, HMS, salmon, and CPS, plus non-tribal directed Pacific halibut. For each of those, there's a description of the fisheries by gear, whether or not a mechanism is available currently within the FMPs or regs to close area for coral restoration and research, and any enforcement considerations. Additionally, we provide some information based on our work with CDFW staff about some state fisheries that may or may not occur in the proposed areas. This is a really high-level analysis. It's just to provide some background information and some context for consideration. Obviously, our ABs, y'all are our experts, so this is what we're really hoping to get some feedback on is how these areas may or may not overlay with your fisheries and gear types. So just wanted to alert you to that attachment and why, this is scheduled as an administrative item and why we alerted all the advisory bodies to this webinar. But that is all I have. So I think next, I know, Karen, you wanted to introduce a few folks.
I did. So in addition to Karen Grimmer and Sage and I, we have with us today, I hope and believe, hopefully you guys can turn on your cameras, is Danny Lipsky, who is the research coordinator for Greater Farallones and Cordell Bank National Marine Sanctuaries, and Andrew DeVogelaire, who is the research coordinator for Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuaries. Both of them have been conducting research on deep sea coral communities throughout both sanctuaries, and Andrew has been actively participating in restoration efforts at Sur Ridge, and they're going to be the best people to answer any of the questions about any of the scientific data we've presented today. So I hope they're here and they'll turn on their cameras and say hello. But if not, Karen and Sage and I are here, and we're here to answer questions as they, thank you, Andrew, I see you now. We're here to answer questions, and we'll just, turn it over to Carrie to facilitate that.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. This is great. It was a really good, informative presentation. Thank you. We're in pretty good shape. We have some time to take questions. As I mentioned at the outset, just as a reminder, this briefing is focused on the council's advisory bodies. And so we're going to look for hands raised, and we'll give priority to members of our various advisory bodies, or our council members or staff. And then if we have time to turn to the public for questions, then we will do that. We're probably not going to have time to take actual public comments. So on is clarifying questions, technical questions about the presentations that you just saw. So the raise hand feature is down at the bottom where that little smiley face is with reactions, and you can click that, and then you can click raise hand. Yeah, that's it. So go ahead. If you have questions, please raise your hand. I'm going to be very surprised if there aren't any questions. Okay, Harrison Eibach, go ahead. You can unmute yourself and then, yeah, go ahead, Harrison. You can start.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Sure can.
Okay, thank you. First and foremost, great presentation. I really appreciate all the information. That mapping tool is amazing, that's for sure. I have a lot of questions, but I will save the vast majority of them for sure for when we actually meet in person in September and have some further discussion. But one of the main questions that I'm kind of wondering by looking at all these areas in regards to the actual coral planting is how much individual planting of corals is going to be taking place, and how much space does each coral that's going to be planted is needed. So I'm looking at the Point Arena South, for example, and I see it's occupying a lot of square miles. All three options occupy quite a bit of space. And so I was just kind of wondering, like, roughly how many individual corals are planning on being planted in these areas? I'll start with that.
I think I'm going to speak just about funding and costs and things that are planned versus things we're pursuing. And then I'm going to hand it over to Andrew to really talk about the science behind outplanting. But just briefly, because I'm not sure if your question also is just about like what's immediately planned, you know, what we have funding for and what we're, you know, planning for funding for in the future. So Harrison, thank you so much for your question. And you know, I think you were there when I presented back in March about the dry dock. And there were some very specific things in that draft restoration plan that are planned based on funds that we know are available. And so we do have an immediate need to address that very specific injury. And in terms of how many can be planted, you know, we have several $1 million available and a range of corals that we are going to target for that particular project. With that said, we are pursuing other funding opportunities. And there is funding that may be headed our way that's related to the Inflation Reduction Act, and there are other funding opportunities that are in the works. And so we assume that these projects, now that it's a viable way to restore damages to our habitats, we are assuming that we are going to be pursuing more projects and more corals in more areas. So that's just from like a practical to, you know, where we're headed for the next 10 years. I'll leave it to Andrew to speak to the science behind the actual planting.
Yeah, so in terms of the sizes of areas, we planted, you know, a dozen corals within an area that's just a square meter. You can put a lot of corals into a small spot, but if you want to restore an area that's been impacted, like by that dry dock, the attorneys would like to have larger areas restored. So it doesn't have to be a big area to outplant a coral, but to restore an area that's been impacted, you'd want to mitigate roughly that area. But this project is research and restoration areas. So some of these areas are quite large because of the research questions that they're asking. So for example, if there are questions that our experts looked into, and like how far can a coral disperse once it's been planted into an area? Some of our transplants, you can clearly see eggs in them, and how far do they disperse? How connected are they to other areas? You need more space to answer those kinds of questions. So I hope that's helpful.
This is Kerry. I want to jump back in. Harrison, you said you have lots of questions, but you wanted to save some for when you convene in September. I would encourage you to ask any, sort of technical or clarifying questions now. And I'm sure between now and the council meeting, if you want to reach out to the sanctuary representatives, you could do that as well. But, the whole purpose of this is to go ahead and get those, questions asked and answered, so that all the advisory bodies are sort of ready to have their discussion. So if you got a couple more questions, I would encourage you to go ahead and ask them.
Thanks, Carrie. I guess one clarifying question that I know the answer to, and I'm sure most people here, but one clarifying question. None of these actual areas, any of these EFHs were actually impacted by the actual sinking of that dry dock, correct?
That's correct.
In the draft dry dock restoration plan, there is a discussion about compensating for injuries, and that is explained there. So I encourage you to look at that. And after looking at that, if you have more questions, we're happy to answer them.
Back to the areas, I thought I'd mention, if we have a little bit of time, as Karen mentioned, the Sur Ridge area is quite large relative to the others. And not only is it because it matches one of those sanctuary ecologically significant boundaries pretty closely, but there's a lot of other instrumentation there. That area, which really isn't fished at the bottom, has become a deep sea coral observatory where we haven't just been developing restoration techniques. There's time-lapse cameras down there. There's eDNA samplers. There's current meters at a variety of scales. We have sediment traps that are collecting marine snow. And we use a benthic respirometer to see how the metabolism of organisms are changing under different ocean conditions. And then sort of separate from the corals, but there's also a hydrophone out there that's measuring ship sounds and whales. So in some cases, these areas are also research areas where there's equipment that it'd be nice if they weren't disturbed, which hasn't been a problem so far at Sur Ridge, I'd say so.
Okay,
Harrison, any other questions?
No, I will leave you with one last comment, and that just being said that due to some ongoing constraints of a lot of our nearshore species, specifically quillback and copper, as time moves on, these areas offshore are going to become increasingly economically important for a lot of the fishing fleet, as there's going to be an increase of effort moving out of the nearshore and moving offshore. But I thank you all very much for your presentation. Mapping tool looks great, and I look forward to further discussions in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the questions, Harrison. Okay, let's go to Marcy Remco and then Dave Kashida after that. Go ahead, Marcy.
Thank you, Carrie. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay, thank you, Karen and company. We appreciate the opportunity to get this early briefing ahead of the discussion in September. I want to just acknowledge the efforts of the sanctuary to coordinate with the council family on the need to adopt and implement fisheries regulations associated with this coral restoration activity. The council has indicated that it wants early consultation and communication with sanctuaries on needs for fishery regulations, and you've certainly brought this proposal to us as early as possible. You agreed to partake in the discussions in the council arena, and you brought us the general concept as soon as you possibly could. I'll say that after seeing the presentation, this is more than I expected. I'm trying to understand what the bare minimum need is here to achieve the mandates of the settlement agreement. Lots of important science here to consider, but I'm kind of losing what the actual request is and where the flexibility lies in terms of what the council is being asked to recommend in terms of the total area to be closed to fishing, and again, what the bare minimum is. Thanks.
Karen, do you want me to start that and you can just chime in? Thank you so much, Marcy. And I think there's a distinction here I want to make clear, which is that when we were looking at this, there's the need based on the injury from the draft dry dock restoration plan. And then we thought about a longer term need and, you know, how best to engage the council on broader needs. And so when we were talking about the injury to from the dry dock, and we were talking about specific areas there, we were linking that need specifically to restoration and specifically to the funds that were available and the cost recovery that is established in draft in that plan. So we were linking our discussions in the areas and what we needed to that. As you know, the decisions were made for the NTRCA, and we looked at really what is it that we need to address this as there could be future incidents that occur, and how can we look at this to address future incidents and our overall research needs and restoration needs. We wanted to make sure that we were putting out the full array of options. And so what you're seeing here, these 10 areas, from our perspective for these two sanctuaries, this is the full array of what is available in our entire sanctuaries based on all the information we have right now. These are the areas that are available for these types of activities. So in terms of moving forward for scoping, what we're suggesting is scoping these areas and figuring out what is feasible and getting that public feedback through this public process so that we can understand how we can, you know, meet our needs and also be beholden to the public needs and the public trust of these resources. So we are, you know, putting forward areas for scoping. We're not saying that there's a set number of areas that are needed. We want to actually give the public and the council and everyone who can do the analysis to give feedback on what's feasible. So that's what we're looking at. So it may seem like a broader scope, but they are the same 5 locations. They're just designed at those locations that are options that can be scoped. And I don't know, Karen, do you have anything to add to that? Did I mischaracterize anything?
No, I think you explained that very well. I think we just wanted to bring all the options to the council, and through the process, I think we can drill down on the reality of what's feasible.
Marcy, any follow-ups?
No, thank you. That helps us think ahead a little bit and appreciate the explanation and how we got to what's in front of us. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcy. Andrew, did you have a follow-up? I thought I saw you maybe unmute yourself. No? Okay. All right, thank you. Then let's turn to Dave Kashida and then Arlene Merriams after that. Go ahead, Dave.
Hi, thanks, Carrie. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for your presentation. I really appreciated that. My question is actually out of kind of curiosity and ignorance. And, as you know, in other parts of the country, we will actually sink items like that dry dock to create a reef, and it's been decontaminated, and all head is material removed. Now, my question is, has there been or will there be ongoing research to see if this dry dock is actually repopulating, regenerating life without our assistance? And are we going to be using that as a data research tool? And that's it. Thank you.
I can try that one. I can start it. I think in the examples that you're thinking of for artificial reefs, usually those are sunk in like sandy bottom areas where there's very little biota. In this example, the sunken dry dock, which was the size of the football field, crushed a whole lot of deep sea coral under it. And so I think definitely there will be monitoring. There's already been some monitoring to look and see the extent of the injury there. I do believe there'll be follow-up on that. But really, the settlement that Karen had mentioned is to compensate for that initial injury of all of the crushed deep sea coral underneath the dry dock. So we're looking to kind of get whole before looking at anything else. So that's why it's called a compensatory settlement. And the project we're proposing is to compensate for that injury. So I'm not sure if I answered your question all the way, but gave it a try.
Thank you, Karen. We have another hand up, Arlene Merrims. If anyone else has just joined us recently, we are in the Q&A stage. We've got a few more minutes on the coral restoration and research item. And if you do have a question, then use the raise hand feature, please. So Arlene, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. So just to follow up on what Karen was just explaining, I have a two-part question, I guess. So there are 10 areas that are the full array, as you said, as to what is available for meeting your research and restoration and recovery needs. But it's at 5 different locations. So are you able to give an idea of what the minimum is that you would want to see? Like, is it one site at each of those 5 locations, so that really a minimum of 5 is what you were after? Or, I think that might help the council bodies, to give input to you if there was a better understanding of what maybe the minimum you're looking at for what you need. And then the other question is, some of this is specific to the dry dock, funding and legal restoration requirement, but some of this is separate from that for more future incidences. So can you separate the need for each of those in terms of number of sites?
Thank you, Arlene, so much for that question. I'll take a stab at your second piece of that, which is that we, for the dry dock, draft dry dock restoration plan, and I just need to clarify, we're in draft right now. We're not final, because we need to understand the range of things that we can do for this project. So for that plan, we have said, that we're looking, and this again is funding driven, at 2 to 5, and I think we used the word location, but what we were looking at is 2 to 5 areas when we had put that out, like if you translate it to the 10. So we said that in terms of the dry dock. And one of the reasons we said that, and I want an opportunity to reiterate this, is depth is really important here. And the fact of the matter is that different locations have different depth ranges. And so when you're looking at injury recovery, and you're looking at a seascape approach, again, this is defined in that restoration plan. We don't necessarily want to put all our eggs in the one depth basket, so to speak. So that's why we said that very specifically for that project. And again, I hope I'm answering the second part of your question, which is about what we're asking for that's specific to this scoping document. And what we are asking for is to scope all 10 of those areas. And so at this time, we aren't trying to have pre-decisional determinations on what the appropriate number of places, areas, locations are for this broader, more holistic need we have as sanctuaries. I hope that answers your question.
Can I add just one point? Sorry, I was just going to add one point onto that, which I think is kind of self-explanatory, but just in case it's not. So for the areas that have the locations that have multiple areas. So for example, at Point Arena, where they're nested, the areas are nested, it would make sense to select one area there eventually. So there's a choice of 3, they're nested within each other. So does that make sense? There would be a choice for one in that area, as an example.
Yes, that's more clear. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Karen. And I know we're wrapping up with time, Carrie. I did just want to say I will be at the council meeting in September, arriving on Friday and staying through Monday, and at least another team member will be there with me, and we're happy to sit down and answer additional questions as each of the advisory bodies have this on their agenda item. I will be available. And at least probably one other team member, if not 2.
Great. Thanks, Karen.
And I'll just, can I add one more thing? Sorry, that I put a link for the website in the chat that has all of these documents that we've been talking about today. So just wanted to mention that.
Thanks, Karen Grimmer. Yeah, and we'll also post these slides to this meeting's webpage afterwards. Actually, they might already be up. I'm not quite sure. But so if anyone wants to go back through them. Thank you, Jessie. Yeah, they are already up there.
Jessie, thank you.
I know, she's on it. We have time for one more question. Merritt McRae, why don't we turn to you, and then we're going to move on to the second agenda item. So go ahead, Merritt.
Thank you. I just want to note how impressed I am with the amount of work that's gone into that mapping product that you've put out there for us to take a look at and work with. And again, compliment you on coming to us at the advisory body level and the council early with respect to what you're hoping to accomplish and what your needs are and so forth. I think there's a lot to learn about deep sea corals. We just got through surveying some anthropogenic structures, pipelines, seep tent off of Santa Barbara in the last couple of weeks. And one of the things that we noted was that there was an awful lot of deep sea coral growth on that anthropogenic structure. And I'm really interested in, and I think many people are, as Dave Cachette had pointed out, in exactly what happens with respect to the dry dock itself. The first information that we got was at the Gap was that the dry dock had sunk on soft bottom rather than crushing deep sea corals. And so that information that it has crushed deep sea corals is actually new to us. But I think it'd be interesting to continue to survey that site and see exactly how the natural biota responds to its being there. Thank you.
I might just add, I love these curiosity questions because I'm really curious. We do have a loft shipping container that we have been studying for 16 years in just outside the Monterey Bay, and just finished up a report on that I'd be happy to send around. It's only in the last few years that there started to be any sponges growing on it. No corals yet, but certainly having a larger sample size than one shipping container would be a good idea. And I also think it'd be interesting to go back and periodically look at the dry dock.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks everyone. So let's move on to the second and final agenda item for today. We have Laura Inglesred from the National Marine Sanctuary Program, and I think she has some slides to share on the proposed Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary. And I think Bill Duros he was on earlier. I don't think he has a presentation prepared, but he'll probably be available to answer questions as needed. So Laura, if you're ready, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Thanks, Carrie. Are my slides showing up okay?
Yeah, we see the slide and we hear you.
Great. Well, hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. My name is Laura Inglesrud, and I'm the policy analyst for the West Coast Regional Office in NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries. And I'm also on the Council's Habitat Committee. And today I'm going to be talking about the proposed designation of Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary. So just to give you some background, NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries serves as the trustee for a network of underwater parks that encompass more than 620,000 square miles of marine and Great Lakes waters. And this is a map of the entire sanctuary system, which includes 15 national marine sanctuaries and 2 marine national monuments. And you'll see with the yellow squares on this map, in addition to the proposed Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary, there are 5 other proposed sanctuaries right now that are going through a similar designation process. So we are very excited to announce that the draft designation materials for the proposed sanctuary were released today, and the public comment period officially opens tomorrow. And so we will be holding public information workshops next month, which will provide a chance for the public to ask questions prior to the public comment meetings, which will happen a couple of weeks later. But you can also submit comments online starting tomorrow, and the public comment period closes on October 25th. And you can find all the details for these workshops and public comment meetings and how to submit a comment on the website, which I have a link to on the last slide, and I will also link in the chat right now. There you go. And so just to talk about what these designation materials that were released today, what they are, is the notice of proposed rulemaking, which includes the terms of designation and the proposed regulations for the new sanctuary, a draft management plan, and then a draft environmental impact statement.
Okay.
So here is a timeline. We are now in step 3. And I want to note that we realize the public comment period ends right before the November council meeting, but we are still going to accept PFMC comments during the November meeting. And you can look at the steps that we've been through and also the steps after our current step right now, but we are still aiming to complete this designation sometime next year in 2024. Okay, to give a little background on the purpose of this proposed action of designating a national marine sanctuary in the coastal and offshore waters of Central California, One of our main goals for this was to manage and increase protection of these nationally significant resources off the coast through both a regulatory and a non-regulatory framework. And the regulatory framework you'll find by looking at the proposed rule, and the non-regulatory framework will be through the draft management plan. And another big goal of the sanctuary is to guide comprehensive ecosystem-based and also community-based management to address threats to these resources. And another big goal of this particular sanctuary is to recognize and aid public awareness of Indigenous tribal heritage and culture in the area, and to incorporate that traditional knowledge and facilitate collaborative management with the tribes and Indigenous communities in the region. And so going into the need for this proposed sanctuary, this area is a really important ecological transition zone, and it has really high biological productivity, is important habitat to many endangered species, and it's a huge upwelling center that nourishes important ecosystems. Another need for designating this area as a national marine sanctuary is this area also contains hundreds of shipwrecks of historical importance, including several on the National Register of Historic Places. And also this region has been home to coastal ocean-going indigenous tribes for tens of thousands of years. And submerged village sites may exist along paleo shorelines and the submerged lands of the proposed sanctuary. And so that's something we're excited to look into. And finally, additional protections are needed due to these myriad ongoing and emerging threats to the area from human uses and climate change. And so some of these threats include from offshore energy development, the decommissioning and removal of coastal and offshore industrial facilities, vessel traffic, coastal runoff, and both acute and cumulative impacts of climate change. So here is where we started with the boundary for this proposed sanctuary. This initial boundary alternative, as we call it in the draft environmental impact statement, or EIS, this is very similar to the proposed boundary that was released back in November 2021 with the notice of intent to start the scoping period for the sanctuary. And so from here, we looked at a reasonable range of alternatives. And we looked at both bigger and smaller boundaries, including sub-alternatives that could be added on to certain boundary alternatives shown in the previous slide. And you can read all about these different boundary alternatives in the draft EIS. And this is what we ended up with as NOAA's agency preferred alternative. So the proposed sanctuary designation stretches along 134 miles of coastline and would encompass more than 5,600 square miles of marine waters off the Central California coast. And so after weighing the analysis in the draft EIS under NEPA, which is the National Environmental Protection Act, in addition to all the input we got from cooperating agencies, government to government consultation with the Sayanes Band of Chumash Indians, and outreach with other tribes and indigenous communities on the potential effects from all these alternatives, we identified this agency preferred alternative, which consists of a combination of alternative 2, which was called cropped bank to coast, combined with sub-alternative 5B, the Gaviota Coast extension. And this agency preferred alternative provides a lot of beneficial impacts in different resource areas. And these benefits are largely because of sanctuary regulations that would limit both the scale and scope of offshore development activities and other human uses that could harm these resources. And we've also considered the adverse effects of this alternative and have found them to be not significant under NEPA, while also allowing an acceptable balance between resource use and conservation of sanctuary resources. And so here are some more reasons for selecting this alternative as our agency preferred alternative. And we really considered which boundary alternative would be most manageable while also maximizing the principal purposes for this sanctuary. And so this area includes significant offshore features of national importance, including the majority of the Santa Lucia Bank, Arguello Canyon, and also Rodriguez Seamount. And this boundary allows us to focus management on key areas historically important to the Chumash tribes and natural resources important to them. And including the Gaviota Coast extension within this boundary would provide additional protection of important resources. And it would also include waters off of 3 popular state beaches and parks, Gaviota, Refugio, and El Capitan. And it would ensure that all of Castayet and Naples state marine conservation areas were within the sanctuary. This extension would also include the portion of the Gaviota Coast that was home to numerous large Chumash villages at the time of European first contact. And so ensuring the conservation of these resources we thought was an important benefit to including this sub-alternative in our agency preferred alternative. And just to touch on our choice of including alternative 2 rather than alternative 1 in terms of that northern boundary centers on really 2 principal concerns with designating a sanctuary from Montana de Oro north to Cambria. And the first has to do with subsea electrical transmission cables coming from the Morro Bay lease areas. And we're concerned about the amount of seabed disturbance and the potential ongoing impact on biological resources that could potentially result from the construction, maintenance, and continued operation of between 20 to 30 cables, as well as potential floating substations in this one corridor between the Morro Bay lease areas and shore. And that level of anticipated disturbance would likely be unprecedented within a national marine sanctuary. And the second concern has to do with the lack of agreement regarding the name for the portion of the new sanctuary from roughly Cambria to south of Morro Bay, in particular the waters off Morro Rock. And so during the scoping process and informational meetings, the Salinan bands objected to naming the sanctuary Chumash in that area, which they identify as being part of their ancestral homeland. And the Chumash bands have also considered this section of coast part of their ancestral homeland. And the Halone Salinan did express support for a sanctuary designation of this area, provided it had a different name. But Chumash bands were unwavering in their view that the entirety of the sanctuary should be named Chumash Heritage. And so we think that this alternative for the boundary is responsive to the Indigenous community input by having this option that would help ameliorate those concerns. So getting into the proposed regulations for the sanctuary, designation of this new sanctuary would come with some regulations that protect habitat and species and water quality, for example, while also allowing for human uses that are compatible with resource protection. And these regulations mirror those found at adjacent sanctuaries along the coast of California, especially Channel Islands Sanctuary and Monterey Bay Sanctuary, which are, surrounding the Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary. And I want to note for this group that there are no proposed regulations pertaining to commercial fishing or concerning the speed or routing of vessels. And you can read more about these proposed regulations in the proposed rule, which is linked to from the website that I put in the chat. And just to touch on prohibited activities, so there are essentially 2 types of prohibitions: absolute prohibitions, which basically cannot be permitted, and then those which are permissible with certain conditions and mitigations put on them to be able to protect the resources. And so these are just some examples of prohibitions that I put up on this slide here. And again, you can read more details about this in the proposed rule. And then I wanted to highlight this Rodriguez Seamount Management Zone. And we're proposing a framework for Rodriguez Seamount that is similar to the approach that we've taken for Davidson Seamount in Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. And so with the regulations for Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary, we're proposing to create this management zone to ensure the conservation of the diverse and rare resources found on the seamount, which include coral and sponges and other invertebrates, or also resources living in the water column immediately above the seamount. And the top of the seamount is at approximately 2,000 feet water depth. So under the proposed regulation, there would be a buffer of about 500 feet above the top of the seamount to protect organisms that migrate above the seamount. And important to note also for this group that this prohibition would not apply to lawful fishing activity that is regulated under the MSA and its implementing regulations. And so as you know, a lot of you may know that NOAA has prohibited bottom trawling on and around Rodriguez Seamount since June 2006. And so additional protections provided to this seamount by these proposed sanctuary regulations would protect the high biodiversity and the deep sea habitat on the seamount. And again, you can read more about this in the proposed rule. And so now I just wanted to touch on the draft management plan, which includes 11 action plans that are listed here. And they cover issue-based and program-based themes that are intended to guide the new sanctuary over its first 5 to 10 years of operation. And each action plan contains strategies with multiple activities to achieve the goals. And the draft management plan you can find linked on the website as well. And I also wanted to highlight that a key priority for the proposed Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary is to deliberately provide mechanisms for tribes and indigenous communities to participate. And it is also our intent to highlight and honor the indigenous cultural heritage of local peoples who are the first stewards of these lands and waters. And so we have developed a collaborative management framework to guide and facilitate tribal participation and collaborative management of the proposed sanctuary. And this framework is meant to provide a starting point. You know, we realize that through experience and mutual learning that we will likely adapt and improve this framework over time to build those relationships that we need for sustained success of the sanctuary. And through this framework, we are seeking to offer and support a variety of ways that interested tribes and indigenous communities could get involved with the sanctuary after the completion of the proposed designation. And these opportunities are shown and described on this slide as a series of organizational groups that are really envisioned to interconnect and work together to maximize indigenous community involvement. And you can read more about this proposed framework in the draft management plan. I also wanted to touch on the economic analysis, and you can read more details about this in the proposed rule. And wanted to just highlight that in terms of net effects of our economic analysis, although the benefits can't really be monetized at this point, we do expect net positive economic effects as a result of increased marine conservation, cultural and maritime heritage, recreation, improved recreational experiences, and increased non-market economic value from the protection and management of sanctuary resources. And I wanted to note that through this analysis, we found that small businesses, which include commercial fishing and for-hire charter operations, are not expected to experience significant impacts, and the extent of costs imposed on businesses would be for those seeking a general sanctuary permit, and that would come to, I think, $172. And this slide, I just wanted to kind of take a step back and point out that this sanctuary designation would advance President Biden's America the Beautiful initiative, which is supporting locally led conservation efforts across the country with the goal to conserve and restore 30% of U.S. lands and waters by 2030. And the Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary also reflects the Biden-Harris administration's commitment to honoring tribal nations, respecting indigenous knowledge, and advancing co-stewardship. So I will end my presentation with this map that shows the agency preferred alternative with the existing 4 national marine sanctuaries off the California coast. And I am happy to answer any questions now. And there's the link again to the website where you can find a lot more detail about all of this. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura. Good presentation. We're doing pretty well for time. We're supposed to end at 4, but we always add a disclaimer that says we'll continue until our business has been completed. But anyway, now's the time for Q&A. I see a couple of hands up. If anyone else has questions, please use the raise hand feature down at the bottom of the screen. We will give priority, as I mentioned before, to council advisory body members and council members and members of the general public. Will if we have time, as time allows, we will get to you. So we're going to start, Louis, I see your hand up. We're going to start with Mike Okaneski and then see where we're at. So Mike, why don't you unmute yourself and go ahead.
Thank you for the opportunity to ask a question here. But Laura, I heard you, and just for the record, I'm on the MPC for the Council of GAP and the CPSAS. So I guess I qualify there. But the question I have is, you mentioned offshore energy, and you gave, I think, 20 cables and 2 substations that might be, I guess, going through that area or could go through that area that you're concerned about. I think that's how it was stated. But the other one I'm just asking about, and I'm not going to get into a lot of detail, but any downstream impacts from wind farms themselves, such as effects on upwelling and or wind wakes and the rest of the hydrology that goes with that, I guess. Have you taken any of that into consideration?
Thanks for those questions, Mike. Those are both good questions. To clarify, when I mentioned the potential 20 to 30 cables and the substations, that was an estimate given to us by BOEM, who was a cooperating agency on this. We used, the best information that we had at the time of writing the environmental impact statement. So that could definitely change. I don't know, what the exact plans are yet. I don't think those have really been figured out. But like you mentioned, your second part of your question, through the environmental impact statement, we did want to analyze those kinds of impacts. And so that's why we asked BOEM for, do they have any kind of estimate of what the impacts could be? And so that's what we based our analysis on. But we realized that those numbers of cables and substations and whatnot could definitely change. But we wanted to include the potential impacts of something like that in our environmental impact analysis document. And so again, to your second question, if you go to the environmental impact statement, the EIS, which is linked to on the website, you can read more about those impacts that you mentioned, like the potential effects on upwelling, et cetera. And there's a discussion on that in the physical resources section of the EIS and also biological resources section. And then there's you can read more detail in the offshore energy section of the EIS. That's got a lot of detail on the offshore wind as well. I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Laura. Louis Zim, I apologize. I keep forgetting that you are on the Gap now, and so I didn't mean to.
No,
take it
I'm no
personally.
longer sitting next to my honored council members. So here I am on the Gap.
Hi, Louis. Go
Laura,
ahead.
Thank you. I really appreciate this, and I will be digging into the website. Probably going to have the answer to the question I'm going to ask, but just casually, I didn't hear a mention of the state wind project between Arguello and Conception. Did you address that, or I just missed it?
I don't know if I called that out specifically, but you're right. That is talked about in the draft EIS. We have, if you go to the offshore energy section in the EIS, there's a subsection that's on the state wind projects. And again, I realize that there's been a lot happening with that recently. We tried to, keep the document as up to date as we could, but there are definitely some things that we will need to update for the final documents as well. But yeah, if you go to that offshore energy section of the EIS, you should be able to read about the state projects as well and how they relate to impacts of the sanctuary on offshore energy, because that's really what the environmental impact statement is looking at, the impacts of the sanctuary on the human environment.
Well, thank you very much. And that's exactly why I want to be digging into this, because I had not been able to get enough information on that proposed project. And as you say, it's moving quickly, and it's probably one of our earliest concerns as far as wind and affecting our commercial and recreational fisheries. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Louis. Thanks, Laura. Merritt McRae, you are up next.
Yes, I was actually texting back and forth while Louis asked his question, so this may actually be redundant. There is a proposed wind energy project within state waters. It's actually cited within the proposed Chumash National Marine Sanctuary waters. And I wanted to get some feedback with respect to that and how it impacts consideration.
Sure, yeah. So I don't want to misspeak by getting any of the details wrong, but this is another thing that we do specifically look at different scenarios in the EIS, in that offshore energy section. For example, we look at the scenario of, okay, if the sanctuary is designated before that offshore wind project in state waters goes through, what will happen, and then vice versa. And if the offshore energy project in state waters doesn't go forward, so if you go to that section, you'll be able to see kind of it laid out, like what would happen whichever one happens first, the sanctuary versus the state offshore wind project.
Thank you.
Thanks. I put my hand up because I have a question or two. So let's see. Let me start with one. I've been reading through the pre-publication draft of the proposed rule, and I'm glad you mentioned the Rodriguez seamount. And I just want to make sure that I understand correctly from a fisheries perspective. It sounds like that there are descriptions of the regulations, and some of those regulations include disturbance of the bottom or drilling or things like that. And in many cases, there are exceptions to those, and the regs say that. And for the Rodriguez seamount, tell me if I'm right or wrong on this, Laura. It says that you're not proposing exceptions to things like, other non-fishing activities. So those would be prohibited in the area of the Rodriguez seamount, but you do include the exception to lawful fishing activities. So I want to make sure that that's correct. And then the rule makes the point that most of that is already closed to bottom trawling anyway. So can you confirm that closure or that regulated area around the Rodriguez seamount, lawful fishing activities would have an exception from those regs?
Yes, that is correct. Basically, the exceptions that you were talking about, there's a part in the proposed rule that specifically says the exceptions do not apply in the Rodriguez Seamount Management Zone, and then goes on to specify that fishing, though, is like kind of removed from that. So kind of exactly what you said. It can get a little confusing, trying to parse out the regulatory language, but that's why I tried to have a slide to explain that in this presentation. That, yeah, basically like other than lawful fishing activities.
Okay, thanks. That's what I thought. I just wanted to confirm. So, Louise, your hand's still up, or did you put it back up, or do you have another question?
No, I don't, but I don't see a button to lower hand. All I see is the raised hand. So if you pull my
I can do that. But you can just click the raise hand again, and it'll lower it. Anyway, okay, let's go. Next up, I see Mark Gorelnik, and then Arlene Merrim. So, Mark, why don't you go ahead and unmute and ask your question?
All right. Well, thank you very much for the presentation. We're all looking forward to reviewing the documents that were released today. I just a couple of questions, should be pretty straightforward. One, in your presentation, you expressly said that there would be no restrictions on commercial fishing. The documents refer to lawful fishing. I just want to make sure that when you referred to commercial, you really meant recreational and commercial. And the second question is, the council is not only concerned with direct restrictions on fishing, but on indirect constraints. And I suppose those may be in the detailed proposed regulations. Can you outline any of those, any regulations that might limit any kind of fishing activities?
Sure. Yeah. So I think one thing that would be helpful for you to dig into, besides the proposed rule and the different regulations that have to do with fishing, whether that's directly or indirectly, is to also look at the section in the draft EIS on commercial fishing and aquaculture. And that has some more discussion of how the sanctuary would impact fishing. And so again, I'm hesitant to, in case I get something wrong, but one example I'm thinking of for like an indirect potential impact could be, the need to get like a sanctuary general permit, like I mentioned in the economic analysis slide, and potentially discharge regulations. And without having it like in front of me, I don't want to, misspeak on what those are, but I would look out for those in both the EIS section on fishing and also the regulations in the proposed rule. But like I mentioned in the economic analysis slide, in both that analysis, which is required under the Regulatory Flexibility Act, but also in our EIS analysis under NEPA, we determined that those impacts, whether direct or indirect to fishing, would not rise to a level of adverse impact of significance.
Okay, and did you have a response to my first question?
And what was that? Can you remind me?
Just
the recreational fishing.
Because I mean, you also just again referred to a document on commercial and aquaculture, commercial fishing and aquaculture. And again, is that where I'm going to find any restrictions that may relate to recreational fishing, or is there? I'm just need to be clear that in this proposed sanctuary, as in other sanctuaries, there are both recreational and commercial fishing activities. And so if you say commercial, then that means commercial. And so if we're going to have restrictions or anything on, or say there are no restrictions or no regulations on recreational, it'd be nice to make that clear.
Yes, and sorry if that was confusing. We split it up that way. I believe recreational fishing would be included in the like socioeconomics section of the EIS, which to be clear is what I am more familiar with. That's what I have spent most of my time working on, the EIS. But to answer your question broadly, like, no, this sanctuary, like other sanctuaries on the West Coast, do not have specific regulations regulating commercial or recreational fishing. Sorry if that was confusing.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Thanks, Laura. Arlene Merrims, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Hey, Laura, I'm curious about the restriction on, or proposed restriction on discharges, and if that would include fishing processor vessel discharges as well. Because off Oregon and Washington, there are restrictions under EPA regulations about seafood processors discharging in specific areas related to, hypoxia and ocean acidification concerns. So I'm wondering if under that discharge umbrella, if that would include any kind of seafood vessel processors, if that even occurs in that area.
Yeah, as far as, and again, I would need to, double check the exact language in the proposed rule, but all vessels would not be permitted to discharge within the sanctuary boundary. There are some limited exceptions to that. For example, like Coast Guard vessels that are on active missions that don't have the correct, marine toilet on board. But otherwise, what you're talking about, I believe that would be included in the discharge prohibition.
Mm-hmm.
So, Laura, you're saying there's not an exception for lawful fishing activities or, for that discharge rules.
Not for the discharge rules.
Okay. Thank you. Mike Okaneski, I see your hand back up. Go ahead.
Yeah, just one point of clarification, and if Marcy's still on, maybe she can answer it. But I know that the motherships for whiting are not allowed to come across the border to process. And that's what I think I know anyway. But I don't know of any other activities would qualify for processing at sea, but I'm not that familiar with it either. So I guess I'm just asking if it's actually a concern that's already being addressed by the present regulations.
And sorry, you're asking specifically about processing vessels?
At sea.
At sea?
They are not allowed to come, as I understand it, to come across the California-Oregon border to process hake. The fishing boats go down some distance over the border, and they bring the fish back across the border to be processed in Oregon waters as opposed to California. I don't know if there's any other types of fishing that use at-sea processors that I don't know about. I'm just curious if somebody has an answer to that one.
I do not know, but if anyone else on this call knows, feel free to chime in.
To be determined. Okay, thank you.
I'll take a stab at it so in terms of whiting, yes, Mike's completely correct. In terms of whiting, vessels at sea are not allowed to process at the 42, so south of the Oregon-California border. There are I think there's one, maybe 2 allowances for processing sablefish at sea, but that's few and far between. I think there's like 1 that's allowed to do that from historically, but those are the only ones. I just wanted to confirm that Mike's characterization was correct, and all of the hands are lighting up now. So
Yeah, I forgot about the sablefish, but it used to be all processed at sea, but I don't think too many people do it anymore. But anyway, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, that was Mike. Louis, why don't you go ahead? And
Oh,
then we'll
thank
go
you
to
very
Chumash.
much. All of our CPFVs fillet fish at sea and dispose of the offal over the side on the way back to the dock. Would that be considered processing at sea?
Bill, I see you have your hand up. Are you wanting to answer this question? Because I honestly am not. I don't know the answer to this.
Yeah, I'll join in the discussion here a little bit, and I will say that everyone ought to take, when you get a chance to get some really refined, a chance to read the section of the regulation about discharges, because it's one of the longer regulations and it's got the most number of exceptions written into it. And so there are some of the regulations, like disturbing the seabed and the discharge, that do have exceptions, meaning the regulation doesn't apply for lawful fishing activities. And so one specifically said, the first exception says, except discharge is prohibited, except fish, fish parts, chumming materials, or bait used in or resulting from lawful fishing activities within the sanctuary, provided that such discharge or deposit during the conduct of lawful fishing activities within the sanctuary. And so what that has meant is all sorts of discharge related to, fishermen putting hooks in the water, chumming, fish, maybe from a recreational party boat to get them to come closer to the boat. And Louis, I believe we've always interpreted that to include, as you mentioned, party boats, CPFVs on the return home, and filleting fish and rec fishermen doing that and dumping the fillets over the side. Not the fillet, excuse me, dumping the rest of the carcass over the side. As it relates to the first question that was asked earlier about a processing vessel itself, I'm not sure we have interpreted that exception to include that kind of an activity, that kind of a vessel. We'd have to look into it more. We don't want any sort of, quick opinion at this point in time to be viewed as binding for anyone. But I also don't think, I'm not aware of, and I've been with the Sanctuary Program for 25 years, that we've had those kind of vessels operating within the sanctuary waters. But we'd have to talk with the state, California Fish and Game, and Fish and Wildlife, and with NOAA law enforcement, and with PFMC and NIMS as well, to really get a more refined answer on that. But I will say that there is exceptions throughout the regulations for lawful fishing. They don't include, for instance, discharging of oily bilge water. That's not something that is accepted, whether it's a recreational commercial fishing boat or a recreational boater of any kind. So it's not like it's an unlimited exception, but there are quite a few that are provided for lawful fishing. And to Mark's questions earlier, we interpret lawful fishing in that context to mean commercial and recreational, sport fishing, etc. So I hope that helps at least clarify it a little bit. But again, these regulations are kind of long and they're kind of complicated. While Laura was trying off the top of her head to provide you those answers, I had the ability to look them up, but everyone should be reading them. And then I think it may be quite a bit more clear. One last thing, and then I'll stop. The Chumash Heritage Sanctuary proposed regulations are really similar to like Monterey Bay and Greater Farallones. They're similar to Channel Islands, except they don't, at Channel Islands, like Channel Islands does, have any area-specific closures as Channel Islands has adopted. We don't have those in Chumash Heritage, so there's not any indirect limitations on where fishermen can go either. Thanks.
Thanks, Bill. You're always so helpful. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Let's see. I think we're at 4:00, so let's try to wrap this up here. And let's go to Merrick and then Mike. Merritt McRae. Sorry. And then Michael, if your hand is back up, then we'll go back to you.
Hi, this is Merritt again. I heard that Bill Duros was on the call here, and so I do have a question, probably more directed at him, and that is, which agencies' enforcement officers would be tasked with enforcing sanctuary regulations? Does the sanctuaries envision having their own enforcement?
Yeah, hey Merritt. So I'm just letting you know that nothing's changing with this sanctuary than what we currently do at Channel Islands, Monterey Bay, Greater Fairlands, Cordell Bank, and it's a diversity of agencies. NOAA has its own Office of Law Enforcement, and they're actively involved in all of the sanctuary regulatory issues. There's also collaborations we have with the state of California, mostly California Department of Fish and Wildlife wardens, but sometimes state park wardens and others, depending on the sanctuary, national parks for Channel Islands, and U.S. Coast Guard for all the sanctuaries are also enforcement partners with OLE, and OLE is our sort of ring leader on that regard. And I think Greg Bush may still be on. I saw him on earlier. He may want to add to it, but the gist is nothing's changing for this sanctuary compared to what we have and have been employing for years at the other sites.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. And I saw that Greg Bush put a note in the chat that says NOAA OLE, and his hand is up. So go ahead, Greg. Can't hear you.
I just thought I'd answer real quick that Bill's exactly right. When it comes to the enforcement of the NOAA, of the National Marine Sanctuary regulations themselves, it's the NOAA Office of Law Enforcement. So my office would be responsible for those. We do have enforcement agreements and referrals that are in place. Our enforcement agreement with California Department of Fish and Wildlife, we deputize them to enforce the Office of National Marine Sanctuary regulations and refer cases that they generate to us. And any of the law enforcement agencies can refer those cases to us that are violations of the National Marine Sanctuary Act and their underlying regulations. What this does not do is eliminate all the myriad of other rules and regulations that are applicable to the area. So CDFW is still going to be enforcing their state fisheries regulations. We still have the MMPA, the Endangered Species Act, the Migratory Bird Act, any of the other state park regulations that are in effect. So those other regulations are still in effect and are still being enforced by the respective agencies, including all the safety and vessel requirements the Coast Guard maintains, and operator requirements that are under there. So it's that whole regulatory mix and enforcement mix remains in effect.
Thanks, Greg. Okay, I think I'm not seeing any more hands up. So and we're just a few minutes after 4 o'clock. So I think we can wrap this up. We are at the end of today's agenda. I want to thank all the presenters from all the sanctuaries, both the West Coast program, as well as the Greater Fairlands and Monterey Bay and the proposed Chumash sanctuary. You guys put a lot of work into this today. Thank you. The slides are posted to the this meeting webpage, and that link is in the chat. So you can go grab that link right now, or email me or Jesse or someone else if you can't find that. Let's see. I have more questions, but I'm going to follow up later. As our presenters today mentioned, there are public meetings scheduled, and we'll have reps at the September Pacific Fishery Management Council meeting. And of course, Laura is on the Habitat Committee, so we should have lots of opportunity to ask follow-up questions and have discussion and help the advisory bodies develop comments and recommendations to the council itself. So I guess I want to give a chance to Karen, Reyna, and or Karen Grimmer and Laura, if you guys have any sort of last words you want to mention, and then also to Jesse. So do you guys have anything you want to say before we adjourn?
Karen had to jump off, but from both Karens, just want to thank everybody for your participation and look forward to following up on future meetings and briefings.
Yeah, and similarly, thank you all for listening and for your great questions. And like Carrie mentioned, Bill will be giving a presentation to the council on Monday, September 11th on the proposed sanctuary. And then I will also be attending the September council meeting in person for the days the Habitat Committee is meeting, if you want to chat with me then. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Okay, Jesse, anything from you?
No, I think I'm good. If anybody has any issues finding the materials, like Carrie said, just let us know.
Yeah, sounds good. All right. Thanks again.